21,520 minutes. I want you guys to understand that's a big number. I'm going to say it one more time. 21,520 minutes. You see, in the year 2020, I spent, according to Spotify, 21,520 minutes listening to podcasts. And I think for a lot of you guys, you're like, oh gosh, here we go. We got a real nerd on stage. But for me, it's a way for me to get away. Whether I'm in the car or I'm cooking at home alone, it's my escape. I get to listen to people argue about sports or whatever else it is. And so as a result, as a professional podcast listener, I have absolutely mastered the 15-second skip forward button. And the second I hear any commercial or advertisement, I am smashing that 15-second skip forward button until I can get back to my podcast. I don't care about stamps.com. I don't care about StubHub. And HelloFresh can leave. I want to get back to my podcast. And I say all that to tell you that in our minor league series where we've been going through the minor prophets, I have the great privilege today of bringing you guys Obadiah, the podcast commercial of the Bible. For some of our dads in the room, if you're not getting it yet, maybe Obadiah is kind of like the instruction manual of the Bible. Or maybe for those of you who love to cook, Obadiah is like the intro blog to every online recipe ever. As soon as the page loads, I'm scrolling all the way down to the bottom. Get me past all this mumbo jumbo. I need my ingredients, I need my instructions, and I need to get out of there. See, Obadiah, it's such a weird book. It's the shortest book in the Old Testament, only 21 verses. It's one chapter, 21 verses. And according to Bible Gateway, is the least read book in the Bible. You probably aren't doing your daily devotional on Obadiah, but even though at first glance it may seem like just another angry Old Testament letter, I believe we have so much to learn from it. And hopefully by the end of the day, you'll agree with me too. But see, to understand Obadiah, we have to go all the way back because the root of Obadiah is about tension between God's people in the nation of Judah and a nation called Edom. You see, Edom may not be a big player in many stories in the Bible, but their roots with Judah go way back, all the way back indeed, to Genesis. All the way to the beginning with the story of Jacob and Esau. And if you don't know much about Jacob and Esau, it starts with a man named Abraham, who God said was going to be the father of many nations. And in his old age, Abraham had a son named Isaac. And Isaac had two sons, his firstborn Esau, and then they had Jacob. And the irony and what really foreshadows the story of Jacob and Esau is it's actually told that as Esau is being born, Jacob is born as well, holding on to Esau's heel. And so throughout their lives, there's this weird tension. And all these crazy stories, one of them being that Esau, in a moment of desperation, when he's not really thinking well, trades to Jacob his birthright for a bowl of soup. And then later, as Isaac is in his old age and he's become blind, he knows his days are numbered. So he sends his beloved firstborn son Esau out on a hunt. And when he comes back, he's going to give Esau his blessing. And while Esau is gone, Jacob, with the help of his mother, actually tricks his father in his blindness into believing that he is giving Esau a blessing, when in fact, Isaac gives his blessing to Jacob. And although there's so much more to this story, and if you go back and read it and learn, it's a great story of redemption. Eventually, Jacob goes off and becomes known as Israel. And from his descendants become the nation of Israel, the Israelite people, God's people. And Esau goes up into the mountains and becomes known as Edom. And from his descendants become the nation of Edom. And so for generation after generation after generation, there's this tension between Edom and Israel. And so in the book of Obadiah, you're going to see Jacob and Israel, those words used interchangeably. And you'll see Esau and Edom, used interchangeably. And so basically what's happened here is Edom has just committed the last straw against God's people. It's in the year 587 BC, and although we don't know anything about Obadiah, here's about what we know, that his name is Obadiah, he is a prophet, and it's written about 587 BC. Unlike all of the minor prophets we've had before, it's not necessarily a narrative of the prophet, but rather just a 21-verse vision from a man named Obadiah of the nation of Judah. And it comes in 587 BC as the Babylonian Empire has taken over Jerusalem, torn down Solomon's temple, and exiled all of the Judaites out of the promised land. And in their lowest moment, when they're struggling, a distant relative almost in Edom decides that that's their time to pounce. And they take these inroads against Judah, and they capture and either kill or sell the Judaite people into slavery. And God is mad about it. Real mad. So God decides to go basically full-blown mama bear on Edom. So we're here at verse 1 through 4. Here it is, the vision of Obadiah. This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy was sent to the nations to say, rise, let us go against her for battle. See, I will make you small among the nations. You will be utterly despised. And right here it gets important. It says, the pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground, though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars? From there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. Are we starting to kind of get the idea of why this isn't necessarily the happiest book of the Bible to read? Most people don't go straight to Obadiah. See, what God is saying here is, Edom, you have messed with my people, and for that I'm going to humble you. And the first thing we learn about Edom is that the downfall of Edom was pride. That the root of so many sins is pride. When we believe that we are greater than God, or we've worked our way up to this standing where now we hold the power, is when we start to fall apart. And Edom, although they were kind of an insignificant nation, like we said earlier, not much happens there. They have little side quests throughout the Bible, if you will, but they aren't a major player. But what they did have to be proud of, they took great pride in. And three things specifically I want to note. The first thing is that the Edomites had pride in their natural defenses. Edom was kind of cool. They lived in a nation that was literally etched into the side of a mountain. And so to get up there, not only did you have to climb up this mountain, but the only way into Edom was a narrow, long pathway. It was about a mile long. And so if you wanted to attack Edom, they could see you from a mile away, actually. And so the Edomites had great pride in their natural defense. The second thing is they had pride in their allies. Although they weren't the biggest and baddest, their allies were, and they knew it. It was like that kid in school growing up who wasn't very big and tough, but you know you didn't mess with them because their brother or sister was scary. And they would get you. Or they had friends that were scary. And so you decided, you know what, I'll keep my distance. That's kind of what Edom was like. And so Edom had pride in their allies. And the last thing is the Edomites had pride in their wisdom. See, Edom was renowned for having some of the wisest men in all of the world. It's actually said in 1 Kings chapter 4, they were regarded as the wise men of the East. And so the thing about this is, I want to point this out because in verses 5 through 9, God speaks of Edom's pride, and then he specifically shows them how he's so much greater than anything they have their pride in. So let's go to verse 5. He says, if thieves came to you, if robbers in the night, oh, what a disaster awaits you. Would they not steal only as much as they wanted? If grape pickers came to you, would they not leave a few grapes but how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. God is saying through Obadiah, it's going to be even worse than if robbers came to take you over, because at some point, robbers can't take anymore. That me, the God of Israel, I'm so big, and you messed with the wrong one, I'll take everything from you. And he keeps going. He says, all your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive you and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it. You may have great pride in your allies, Edomites, but what you don't know is they're all going to turn their backs on you, Obadiah is saying. Is that you're going to eat together, and all the while they're going to set a trap under you. You'll be stabbed in the back by your allies. You have pride in your allies, but one day those will fade away. And finally, God says in verse 8, in that day declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, those of understanding in the mountains of Esau? Your warriors, Timon, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountain will be cut down in the slaughter. God says, finally, you have pride in your wisdom, but know that I, the God of Israel, there's nothing they can do to stop me. Even your wisest men pale in comparison to me. And so as I'm reading this for the first time with my wife, Melody, thinking, how am I going to even tackle this at all? How do I get anything redeemable from this? This is the angriest book I have ever read. And what I realized the more I dug in, is that in verse 15, the narrative begins to shift. So for verses 1 through 14, God is zeroed in on Edom. God is declaring to Edom through Obadiah that he is going to humble them. But then out of nowhere, in verse 15, things begin to change. It says in verse 15, the day of the Lord is coming for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and be as if they had never been. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. It was almost really odd to me the first time I read it. It felt like we're like going 100 miles an hour at Edom. We hit verse 15, and we begin to pull the gas off a little bit. We begin to widen the scope, and we're not so zeroed in on Edom anymore, but in fact, the day of the Lord is near for all the nations. And for me, as someone who loves to write, who loves to communicate, it didn't make much sense why we would have such a stark change when 2/3 of what we've already written were so direct. And the more I read, I realized something powerful. See, if you want Obadiah to mean something, if Obadiah is going to be more than just an angry 21 verses stuck in the middle of the Old Testament that you'll never read again, you have to understand that God knows his audience. And just like in school, when you were writing a paper or giving a speech, you had to know your audience, right? That for me personally, I'm gonna speak differently today than I do on Wednesday night to my students. I know my audience. I won't try and be fake hip on Sunday mornings like I try and do on Wednesday nights. I speak differently. And that's because I know the audience is different. If anybody wants to communicate effectively, you have to understand the audience. And what I realized is Edom is not God's audience here. The more I researched, I found out that Edom probably never read this prophecy. That this book, that these words never made its way to Edom, and then I was utterly confused. Why would so much of this be directed starkly at Edom if they were never going to read it? But that's when it clicked for me. And God was like, Alex, stop being a dummy. Here's what this means. Is that Obadiah wasn't written to scare Edom, but to give confidence to Judah. One more time. When we understand this, the whole book flips on its head. Listen, Obadiah wasn't written to scare Edom, but to give confidence to Judah. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but to really set the stage here, we know this was written in the year 587 BC. Been through it. They are down bad. Over the last several years, there's been this tension growing with the Babylonian Empire, and eventually in 587 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, one of the coolest names in the Bible, attacks Jerusalem, destroys Solomon's temple, and kicks all of God's people out of their promised land. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Judah here. They've lost their city, they've lost their temple, and now they have nowhere to go, no home. The land God promised them is gone, and I would have to imagine that at some point it feels like God doesn't care. That every time they've fallen, it feels like they get kicked in the mouth when they try and get up. They're exiled, left from their promised land. Can it get any worse than this? Yes, it can. Their people are captured and murdered or sold to slavery. They've lost family, they've lost friends, and a lot of them probably feel like they've lost their God. Obadiah wasn't written to scare Edom, but to show the people of Judah these two things. We can't miss this. First, that it all belongs to him. God's reminder to Judah is it may feel like I'm not there, but at the end of all of this, there will be no king, there will be no kingdom or no nation that stands above me. That it all belongs to him. And secondly, it shows that God vindicates or justifies his people. That in their lowest moment, Obadiah was almost written to show the people of Judah that I'm going to fight for you, and I'm going to do it in ways you would have never guessed. You don't mess with my kids, and that the God of Israel is assuring them that at the end of the day, no matter how hard today looks, I promise you I'm fighting for you. Even when it's unimaginable, unthinkable, and seems impossible, Obadiah is a reminder to the people of Judah that he justifies his people. And I know it might be easy to think, well, Alex, how does this Old Testament, Old Covenant story mean anything to me? And I'm so glad you asked. Is that the crazy part is about 600 years after Obadiah is written, that God will send his son, Jesus. Fully God and fully man. He'll live a blameless life, and he'll die on the cross, sacrificed. So that now our relationship with God, our ties with God, our covenant with God, it's not based on the things we do. It's not based on rules. It's not based on heritage or land, but rather based solely on the grace. That when we open up, that when we fall on our knees, now every single one of us has access to the relationship that Judah had. That every single one of us can call on the name of God, call Father, and we know that he fights for you. And that now because of Jesus, 2,600 years later, I believe that Obadiah, God is using the same message for some of you here today. These last 12 months have been so hard. We've lost people we loved. We've lost our jobs. Friendships have been ripped apart. Families torn from each other. The most vile and ugly things our world and nation have to offer have been on display for all to see. Nothing has survived this last year. And for some of us, maybe a lot of us, we've just thought, well, hopefully the next day is better. Maybe tomorrow. And then the next day comes, and the next day. And it seems to get darker and darker. And it feels like every time we stand up, we get punched in the face again, much like Judah probably felt all those years ago. And see, the reminder that God is giving us today is much like the reminder he gave the people of Judah in the book of Obadiah, is that he owns it all. And that God vindicates his people. He justifies his people. You're not justified by whether you live up to his standards. You're not justified by where you are in your life right now, but rather by the goodness and grace of God. And I want to close with a story that happened actually in the nation of Judah just a couple hundred years before the book of Obadiah. It's my favorite story in the Bible. This today has gotten me through the hardest of times in my life. And it's in 2 Chronicles 20. And King Jehoshaphat was a king of Judah, and he had just gotten back from this great war. I imagine he's lost people he loved. He's seen things he wishes he would have never seen, and he probably just wants to rest. Spend some time with his family, figure out how the nation of Judah is going to move forward after all of this. And it says almost immediately a messenger comes up to him and he says that the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Meunites are coming from, guess where? Edom. And they're all coming to attack Judah. And it says in that moment, Jehoshaphat is filled with fear. He doesn't know what to do, but what has always been so powerful to me is he actually knew exactly what to do. Is in a split second, he knew that he needed to get his nation together, get God's people together, and he needed to fall on his face and pray. And he calls all of Judah to the city of Jerusalem, which a couple hundred years later would be taken over by Babylon. And they all come to the temple, which so many years later would be destroyed. And he goes on this long, beautiful soliloquy of a prayer where he says, God, have you not took care of us before? God, will you please take care of us again? And in verse 12, he ends it with the verse that really has changed my life. So simple yet so powerful. He says, for we are powerless against this great horde that is coming against us. Here's what he says. Here's what moved me so deeply. He said, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. You see, the thing that was the downfall of Edom was pride. And what I think the lesson God is trying to learn and teach the Judaites again is that when we have humility and we fall on our face, we know that God will take care of us. And the more I learn about humility, the more I realize it's actually kind of this radical concept. Because at first glance, you would think that humility was the absence of pride. But I really believe more and more that humility is actually just the redirection of where we put our pride. That we don't put our pride in ourselves, but rather we put all of our pride in Jesus. That when we humble ourselves, we say, I can't do any of this, but I know you can do all things. And just as the Edomites had pride in their wisdom, we know that we have pride because we have not our own wisdom, but the wisdom of God through the Holy Spirit. And the Edomites had pride in their allies, but we know that we don't need that because our ally in God, we have such great pride in because he's the God of the universe. And lastly, the Edomites had great pride in their natural defenses, and we can put our pride in our supernatural defenses. So today, if you're down bad, if you are beaten up, I want to tell you that I think the book of Obadiah for you can be as simple as going to God and saying, God, I don't know what to do, but I know you do. And when we fall on our face and we give our lives to Christ, we know that even if tomorrow really sucks, and the day after that, and even if we don't know when it's going to get better, we know for a fact that at the end of all this, there will be no kingdoms. There'll be no kings, there'll be no nations, but only the kingdom of Israel, God's kingdom, will stand. See, Obadiah closes so beautifully, verse 21. He said, and deliverers, that's the first time I've said that word right this entire time. I hope you know that. Deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. I have something for two people here. Maybe the first of you, you love God, but you feel like you've been completely beaten up. And you feel like maybe God's left you in the dirt. What I'm begging you to do today is, I don't have a promise for when it's going to get better, but I do have a promise that when we put our hope in Him, everything changes. And then for the second of you who have maybe never known anything about this Jesus thing, or maybe you've never wanted anything to do with it, I'll tell you this. It's so beautiful because it costs you nothing, yet everything at the same time. That now, because of Christ, because He laid down His life for us, we don't have to make silly sacrifices anymore. We don't have to measure up to the goodness of God anymore, but rather God met us where we were and He pulls us out of our brokenness. And when we turn to Him and we give our lives to Him, that grace through faith, we're now justified, and we know that no matter what happens, no matter what tomorrow looks like, we know that God justifies His people because He's a God of justice, and we belong to Him. I know it might be hard right now, and if it's not, I have great news. It's going to get really hard at some point in this life. And what God was saying through Obadiah will ring true every moment of your life. And that's that even when you can't see it, even when you feel so broken and beaten down, that the God of Israel fights for you. You are justified through His grace. Pray with me. God, we're so grateful for your word. That when even at first glance, something so angry or so insignificant, we know that it's there for a reason. God, we know that sometimes we need to be reminded of just how good you are. We need to be reminded of just how hard you fight for us. We need to be reminded that no matter how big any problem may seem, that you, the God of the universe, are so much bigger. You're so much greater, God. Again, I pray that if you're calling any of us back to you or to you for the first time, God, that we'll fall on our knees. And just like Jehoshaphat did some 2,800 years ago, we'll look to you and say, man, we are powerless against this life sometimes. We are powerless against the great horde that is coming against us. But we know that although we don't know what to do, God, we set our eyes on you. That's our prayer today, God. That we would understand that when we humble ourselves, that we don't release ourselves from all pride, but rather we just know that our pride comes from you and it's not of us. God, we surrender everything before you today. We thank you so much for your goodness, for your grace, and most importantly, for Jesus and the cross. We love you. And it's in your precious name we pray.